Okay, well, good afternoon. So what I would like to do today is look at the history of air pollution. My goal is to give you some understanding of the historical background and the reasons for studying air pollution science and engineering. Why do we care? The photos here are actually taken back in about the 1950s, 1960s. As a kid, I can remember going on vacation up to typically up north in Maine. I grew up in northern New Jersey, and I can remember driving home and driving south and getting just north of Boston, and you could see this orange haze on the horizon. We'll talk about why. What is that? We'll look throughout the semester at issues like that. How have we controlled it? What have we done to improve air quality? And what do we need to do to continue improving air quality? We'll look at it both from the indoor air quality. So what are the issues related to living indoors? We spend about 93% of our lives inside in a building. What are the concerns with air quality? How do we protect human health when we spend so much time inside? We'll also look at air quality outside, so ambient air quality, and we'll look at occupational hazards. Today, what we're going to do is we're just going to walk through kind of history. So we're going to start way back in ancient Rome. We often think about air quality from the perspective that it's recent, that it's something we never worried about, or no one ever worried about in ancient times, but that's not true. The Romans talked about the smell of burning coal, described it as disagreeable, troublesome. These are actually comments of the 3rd century, a student of Aristotle, Theophrastus. I'm not going to pronounce it. Anyway, he was a student of Aristotle. The philosopher and statesman Seneca described the air as being oppressive. And the Roman air was described as heavy heavens. So they recognized that there were these issues of air quality. Anybody want to try and venture a guess? I mentioned burning coal as one of the causes. Potentially, what are some other causes that you think might have resulted in these oppressive conditions?
They didn't have manageable wastewater systems.
Exactly. They didn't have manageable wastewater systems, so decaying trash, decaying sewage, that would cause all sorts of malodors. What else? They used
firewood.
Wood for firewood, exactly. Anything else?
With their method of transportation, the horses and drawn carriages.
Obviously, and with the decaying trash, sewage, the manure from the horses, all of those would cause malodors. Anybody know what they lined the aqueducts with?
Concrete.
They used stone to build them, but what did they line the conduits with? They lined it with lead. So in order to produce the lead, in order to line these aqueducts, they had to smelt it. So lead smelting resulted in a significant amount release of lead into the atmosphere. In fact, based on ice cores in Greenland, the lead concentration during the height of the Roman era was about 4 times background levels. So extent, very high concentrations of lead in the air. The other issue is tanning of animal hides. That releases a significant amount of odor. So those are some of the causes. What are some of the solutions? There's a clue in the photo.
You use
For
chimneys.
water management?
Chimneys. Exactly. Build higher chimneys. We've actually done this fairly recently in terms of dealing with air pollution. Build higher chimneys. They had chimneys that were up to about 25 feet tall. Attempt to try and release those pollutants above the breathing zone, and hopefully they would disperse and be less problematic. They also did, somebody said water management, waste management, exactly. They built sewers to try and transport that waste away from the living areas in order to reduce the pollution levels. They also built beach houses to try and escape the conditions. So in the worst of the conditions, you could go to your beach house and get away from the pollution. They also used public policy. In fact, Rome's public health programs were actually better than most of the public health programs until recent times. Plutarch, who was a philosopher, he was a historian, he was also the priest of the Temple of Apollo, which would have been very important at the time, was a champion of human rights. And I don't really think about it, but I mentioned the lead smelting. Well, they decided that they needed to protect their own citizens by not allowing them to work in the lead smelters. So initially it was like there was the slaves that they were going to put in the lead smelters, but then they decided that it wasn't fair to just make the lead smelters, the slaves suffer from the lead in the smelters. So then actually Plutarch suggested that only criminally convicted slaves should go into the lead smelters. Obviously, this is not a viable, proper solution to occupational exposures, but they did attempt to put in some policies in place. And they did feel that clean air and clean water was public property and the benefit of all. So they did look at public health in that light. Fortunately, they did not realize that, or did not connect the contaminants in the lead smelters with actual lead, and they added lead acetate to their wine to sweeten the wine and basically poison themselves with the lead acetate in their wine, even though they understood that breathing the air from the smelters was hazardous to their health. Now, the issues of air pollution didn't end with the end of the Roman Empire, continued on in England. One of the issues was burning sea coal, and you can see the sea coal here. Sea coal is a very soft coal. It washes up onto the beaches in England, and people could go and collect that sea coal. So it was a free source of fuel. But because it's very soft, it burns, it's a dirty fuel. It produces a significant amount of particulate matter. So in 1272, King Edward I tried to ban sea coal. The penalty was death. It didn't work. People didn't have much other choices. Wood was scarce. So in order to try and survive through the winter, people continued to burn sea coal. And that continued. Decade later, Richard II tries to ban or restrict the use of coal. 1400s, Henry V tries to restrict coal. A century later, Queen Elizabeth tries to ban the use of coal. None of this worked, simply because it was cold, it was damp, and people needed to keep warm, and there wasn't any other source or any other significant source of fuel. So in 1606, Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, and there was a reference in Macbeth to the poor air quality in England, specifically London, predominantly London. Anyone want to guess what that reference is? I remember reading Shakespeare. I'll give you a clue. It has something to do with the witches. Well, the witches chant, fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and filthy air. That really is a reference to the poor air quality. 60 years later, or some 60 years later, John Evelyn, who was a 17th century writer, he realized the issues related to the poor air quality in his home city of London, and he wrote a document called Fugium. This was actually a document written to King Charles II about the impact of air pollution on health and on the environment. So it's the first known document that I have seen really talking about the effect of air pollution on public health and the environment. And the main issue was coal, the smoke from burning coal. Continues. They realized that there was issues with air quality. Few solutions at this point in time. 1873, the air is described as being a coal smoke saturated fog. And in this case in London, it hovered over the city for days, causing roughly 268 deaths from bronchitis or pulmonary disease. 1879, again in London, this was almost 4 months of what they referred to as sunshineless gloom, again from the burning of coal. By 1902, a biweekly fog report is produced describing the air quality. Anybody recognize the painting or the artist?
Is it Monet?
It is Monet. And what we don't realize is that a number of Monet's, in fact, quite a few of Monet's paintings are actually of London. And he was intrigued by the effects of light through the smog. And what he's actually painting or depicting is the poor air quality. If you look up the Charing Cross Bridge painting, same thing. Look at a number of his paintings, and really what he's depicting is the light refracting off of the particulate matter. And it gives that kind of hazy impressionist perspective. It wasn't just London. The US had its own problems. Significant air pollution, to the point where in the late 1800s, Cincinnati and Chicago both enact air pollution regulations. Early 1900s, the city of Chicago passes an ordinance to try and reduce the smoke emitted by the factory. So we've got the height of the Industrial Revolution. We have no significant regulations. We have no federal regulations at all. And we're seeing significant issues with air quality. In 1901, there was an anthracite coal strike that resulted in a shortage of fuel for heating. And as a result, Robert Thurston wrote a report to the Smithsonian, or it was published in the Smithsonian Annual Report, documenting the potential for alternative energy. So at this point, because of the coal strike, because of the lack of fuel, they started looking at alternative energies. It really wasn't because of air pollution, it was because of the strike. They looked at tidal, wind, and solar power. And interestingly enough, in 1901, the recommendation was that solar power was the most, had the greatest potential and should be considered. Interestingly, it really wasn't until the last 10 or so years that we really started investing in solar power. Now, despite what the Romans knew, despite all of the air pollution incidents during the 1200s all the way to the 19th century, air pollution events continued into the 20th century. We'll look at three. These are really the three most commonly discussed air pollution events of the 20th century. They are not the only ones. There are books written about the various different events. So, first one we'll talk about is the Meuse Valley in Belgium. This is an area along the River Meuse. It is a very heavily industrialized area in continental Europe. There were steelworks, zinc smelters, glass manufacturers, fertilizer plants manufacturing, or explosive manufacturing plants all along this river valley. On December 1st, in 1930, a thick fog covered a large part of Belgium. People reported sore throats, shortness of breath. People suffered from severe respiratory distress, coughing, asthma-like symptoms, vomiting. The population that was most affected were the elderly, asthmatics, and those with heart disease. More than 60 people died. There was a tenfold increase in mortality. And when they did autopsies on these people that died, they actually found pure carbon soot in their lungs. Not only did humans die, but also cattle, birds, and other animals suffered, and many died because of this event. We'll talk about why these occurred after I go through the three events. Dinora, Pennsylvania is located in the Monongahela River Valley. It's about 20 miles south of Pittsburgh. It's a very hilly area. It's an industrial town. It's with a steel mill, sulfuric acid plant, freight yard. Population was about 14,000. U.S. Steel Company had its facility in Dinora. There's also the Dinora Zinc Works. And about 5,000 people were employed in these facilities. Now, I've mentioned to River Valley. The hills are quite steep in this area. What happened was that in October 1948, a thick yellow acrid smog enveloped the town and stayed there for about 5 days. When it finally cleared, they realized that 20 people had died during these 6 days. Another 50 were dying. Hundreds were suffering or would suffer from permanent lung damage from this event. It's actually never known exactly how many people died. The significant attempt, an actually quite successful attempt, to hide the information, it wasn't until 1994 that a full accounting of what actually happened was released. And the people that suffered were never fully compensated for the effects of this event. And the last one I'll mention is, again, back to London. This was in December 1952. It was an unusually cold winter, and that resulted in an increased coal consumption. So we're back to that issue with consumption of coal. The air pollution was so bad that the air was described as thick as pea soup. You've heard that phrase? That's where it comes from. It comes from especially in London, the air quality or the poor air quality that often occurred in London. As a result, there were at least 4,000 deaths in 2 weeks. The air was so polluted that public transportation stopped. It was like night all day long. You can see the bus in the photo. You can see with its lights on. That was during the day. Indoor concerts had to be canceled because the indoor air quality was so bad because of this no air purification systems. You're just ventilating the outside air. People couldn't even see the stage, so they had to cancel the concerts. What you see in this plot here is the significant increase in the number of deaths. So you can see the deaths here. So you can see the significant increase in the number of deaths. You see a significant increase in the SO2 levels, the sulfur dioxide, and you see a significant increase in here. What's described here is smoke, and now we refer to this as particulate matter, and we will talk about this later, but you'll often see it as PM, and you'll see it as PM10 and PM2.5, and that has to do with the size of the particles, and we'll talk more about that throughout the course and why it's important. Why do we break down PM10 versus PM2.5? And this is just another plot. You can see here's where the fog occurred. And most of the deaths, the peak occurred actually after the fog had lifted. But people are significantly affected by it. It's not uncommon. You can see here that bronchitis is the major cause of death, but because of the impact on the cardiac system, you see an increase in heart attacks during air pollution events. All of these cases occurred during what is referred to as an anticyclone inversion. So what happens there, as you can see in the photo here, is you've got a descending movement of air. So the air is being pulled down to ground level. You're not getting dispersion of that contaminant. It's just sitting close to the ground level. You've got a relative increase in atmospheric pressure, and these are typically associated with periods of very still, calm, and often cold air. It's also occurred typically in river valleys or plains where the air gets trapped in the valley and you get very little movement, essentially very little ventilation and dispersion of these pollutants. Result in chemical irritation of the exposed membrane surfaces, so they're affecting the nasal membranes, the sinuses. Most of these are all associated with sulfur oxides, predominantly sulfur dioxide, and associated with particulates. And when we'll talk about the respiratory system and why this is important, but this combination of sulfur dioxide and particulates is extremely deadly, much more so than even if both of them are separate. Typically, death occurred within about 1 to 2 days of the episode, but the increase in mortality often continued for weeks. With Dinora and Muse Valley, because of the smeltering, they believe that there was fluoride in the air, and that may have worsened the problem. Nobody was out there measuring concentrations of these. You can see it on this slide here. And they do have some measurements, 1952, mainly for smoke and sulfur dioxide. They weren't measuring anything else besides that. Any questions about any of these incidents? The next three that I want to talk about are slightly different. These are occupational or industrial events. So the others are much more widespread. The sources are much more varied. These were the three that I'll talk about are really the result of a singular event. So with Poza Rica is in the north central Veracruz state of Mexico. It is an important petroleum producing region. They were processing high sulfur crude oil. There was a hydrogen sulfide flare, and that inadvertently went out, releasing hydrogen sulfide to the atmosphere. Happened that there was also at the same time when this happened an inversion in the valley. So there was light wind, this foggy atmosphere, and this resulted in 22 sudden deaths, 320 hospitalized. The effect was almost immediate for those individuals that were in the closest vicinity to where this flare was located, and it caused both respiratory and central nervous system effects. In terms of those hospitalized, they were people of all ages. But single event because of a flare going. The second event is in Italy. This was at a chemical processing plant, and they were producing hexachlorophene. Hexachlorophene was used as a topical antiseptic, very commonly used at the time. A valve malfunctioned, releasing a cloud of this chemical, this dioxin. And that cloud traveled southwest. This tetrachlorodibenzoparadioxin is considered one of the most toxic chemicals created by humans. It happened to be on that day, it was present at a higher concentration. It's an impurity produced in the production. So what it did was it contaminated an area about 6 kilometers long, so about 3.5, 4 miles long and 1 kilometer wide. The result was chloracne, which is basically a skin irritation. There were also fears of genetic impairments because of this chemical, and it bioaccumulates. So it accumulates in the fat, which means that as you go up the food chain, the concentration increases. So as a result, on the fear that it would bioaccumulate and then be consumed by humans, about 80,000 animals, predominantly poultry and rabbits, were killed in order to try and prevent that dioxin from getting into the food chain. Long-term effects have been an increased risk of breast cancer and an excess of lymphatic tumors. The third incident was in 1984. It occurred in Bhopal, India, and it occurred at a Union Carbide pesticide facility. There's a leak. The number of people that died as a result of this event have been estimated from between 4,000 up to about 15,000. Hundreds of thousands of people were injured, more than 100,000 with permanent disabilities. So what happened was malfunction again in the facility. Methyl isocyanate was used as an intermediate in the manufacture of 7, which is a pesticide. So to produce this, they take carbon monoxide, react it with chlorine to produce phosgene. Phosgene is a chemical weapon that was used in World War I. So not a good chemical right there. And then that phosgene is combined with methylamine to produce the methyl isocyanate, which is an irritant to the lungs, causes edema, causes bronchospasms, corneal opacity. It's thought that potentially hydrogen cyanide was also produced as a result of this malfunction. In 2010, 7 ex-employees were convicted of criminal negligence, and it was because the working conditions at this plant were absolutely horrendous. Had a horrible safety record. The manuals that they had were produced in English, but few could read those English manuals. Their monitoring in their plant was extremely poor. There were communication gaps between Union Carbide and the Indian company that was actually operating the plant. They had absolutely no action plan to deal with a disaster, and they had had numerous safety violations that were not dealt with. It's just a horrible picture showing how bad the situation was. Second to the last event that I'll talk about is the World Trade Center. 9/11, 2001. We don't think of it as a air pollution event, but it very much was an air, in addition to all of the other destruction that happened. But it was really an air pollution event. When those buildings collapsed, asbestos was released, silica was released, the particulates, plastics that burned, and the chemicals from there. Those that were most affected were the first responders, and it's believed that at least 10,000 first responders were exposed to high levels of these various different pollutants. They experienced ear, nose, and throat irritations, coughing, wheezing, shortness of breath, bronchitis. Even those that lived in the area were exposed. Even if they were outside of the area of the explosion, they were still subjected to or exposed to these concentrations or these various different pollutants. There was absolutely no measurement of these pollutants in the immediate days after 9/11. So we know very little about what these individuals were exposed to, but what we have seen is an increase in prostate cancer, thyroid cancer, multiple melanoma among those first responders that assisted and were the heroes after the towers were hit. We're also seeing men with breast cancer at much higher rates than we would expect. And those really, again, are in those workers, those first responders that were near ground zero. So we don't think of it as an air pollution event, but it is an air pollution event. Last year at this time, there were major fires throughout Australia. You can see in the map here, this was a map of the hotspots as of January 5th, 2020. So they began their year and they ended 2019 and began 2020 with these massive fires. And just give you kind of an extent of the size of these, this image here compares the 2018 California fires to fires in the Amazon, fires in Australia. They had a 3-year drought, some of the hottest temperatures on record, up to about 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And as a result of this, the fires were so intensive, they caused what are referred to as Pyrocumulus Clouds. These clouds are actually caused by the fire, caused by the heating of the air from the hot fire, causing these clouds. They can then induce thunderstorms, lightning, and then that lightning further propagates these fires. And that's what was happening at this time. And that's why you see these fires all over much of the coastline of Australia. So they try and control one fire, and then you'd get these lightning caused by the fires, and it would start another fire elsewhere. The air quality was horrendous. At one point, the air quality index was 3,000 in Canberra, which is the capital of Australia. That is in, you can see it from this figure here, kind of a sense. That is in the, oh, you can see kind of looking at the scale here. You know, you want levels down under 50. See 3,000. This is hazardous. This is where it really is, it is really hazardous to your health to even be outside. Caused respiratory distress. Airports were closed because of the heat generated. It caused turbulence during flights, and nearly 3 billion animals were either killed or displaced by the fires. You could actually see the fires from the satellite images. In terms of just some recent events, and we will talk throughout the semester about COVID-19. COVID-19 is transmitted through aerosols. We'll talk more about what that means. These links actually do work. You can want to read more about it. But why it is really important that we consider that in terms of indoor air quality and protecting our population from disease. Recently in LA, because the incidence of COVID is so high, they actually suspended mercury regulations for a crematorium. The mercury is actually from dental amalgams, but there are mercury regulations to try and reduce mercury levels in the ambient air. But those were actually suspended because of, fortunately, the backlog of bodies from people that have died of COVID. There was a recent rule put in place under the previous administration, and it's basically a fossil fuel friendly rule. One of the things is that we are still using, we'll talk about the Clean Air Act, we're using the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. They have not been amended since then. So what happens is the administration produces rules, and these rules are actually much easier to turn over or vacate, and these were vacated by the court. Recently, the Bay Area had the worst air quality in the world, and the photo, bottom photo on your right, is actually from the Bay Area in California. Just to give you a sense, we're still dealing with air quality, air pollution events, and we still need to find ways to improve our air quality. So happy to take any questions you may have. We don't have a lot of time left, but happy to answer any questions that you have in the remaining time.